Most people are not equipped to understand the seemingly endless facets of an HOA. That's why we're here, to help you become uncommonly prepared to serve your HOA. Whether you're a board member or a manager, join us in the Uncommon area.
Welcome to the Uncommon area, where we apply an uncommon perspective to better understand what you need to know to operate an HOA. And today our question is, what do we need to know about repiping? And to help with that, I'm joined by a couple of people here from Action Property Management, Matt Davidson, our Executive Vice President, and John Ramirez, our Regional Manager for Engineering. And just want to thank you both for being a part of this. And I guess just to kick things off, John, I think it'd be helpful if you could just kind of give us a quick explanation. When we talk about repiping in an HOA, what are we talking about? What does that even mean?
Well, basically going into the walls and getting into all the cast iron piping, meaning all the vertical lines for the kitchen sinks, drain lines for the bathroom sinks, and drain lines for the bathroom tubs. And that also entails opening up a lot of walls.
All right, so you say that it's getting into the walls with respect to cast iron piping. When we're talking about repiping, we're talking about literally removing pipes from the walls and putting in new pipes?
That's correct. So basically, you're going to take the old and put back new. And there's two different pipes. There's cast iron pipe and there's copper pipe. So depending on what you're doing, can entail a whole different scope of work.
Okay, but we are when we just use the phrase repiping, we're just to be clear, we're talking about taking pipes out of the walls, putting in new pipes with respect to plumbing in an HOA building.
That's correct. Yes.
All right, and then maybe just to kind of set the stage, Matt, you've been in this business for a while. You have some experience or background in buildings and associations that actually have done repiping. Maybe you can speak a little bit to just what your experience has been in this.
Well, yeah, my experience actually is more limited when it comes to repiping because of how complicated it can be. And I have a lot more experience with trying to figure out ways to save the piping that's already there and prolong the life of it.
Yeah, John's already just started off kind of painting a really dire picture right out the gate that we're talking about, opening up walls and taking out all the pipes that are in the walls and replacing them all. And we'll talk about what that actually looks like in a minute. But John, what's your experience in actually going through and in dealing with repiping issues?
Well, basically, I've been part of multiple retrofits, cast iron and copper. We've been with a lot of properties that are, aging within time. And I've been involved with different developers, different third-party vendors on changing them out and getting them replaced.
So it does sound like this is not the main choice, or this is not something that a board of directors of an HOA would say, hey, let's just go repipe. We're excited about doing that. So why don't we start off with talking about what do we do to avoid getting into that situation? And Matt, maybe you can start off with that. What are things that a manager or a board member really needs to keep in mind with respect to maintaining their building to not put themselves in a position where someday they're going to have to repipe or to delay that even?
Yeah, I would say, two of the most important things that you can do to prolong the life of the piping that you have is on the domestic water side. So just your hot and cold, like drinking water. If you're having pinhole leaks, then look into corrosion control, like a phosphate injection into the water, which can help preserve the integrity of the water pipes.
All right, well, let me stop you right there. So I'm a manager. I've never even heard the words that you just said. Who do I ask about that? Like, what kind of a vendor would I go to?
There actually are a lot of companies that specialize in water treatment. And this is really common in big high-rise buildings, especially like in the hospitality space and hotels.
Okay.
So,
and this would apply also in like your garden-style condominium building as well?
It probably would. You have the most frequent issues when you have recirculating hot water. And it's easiest to do something like that if there's like one main water source. So if every single unit has its own water supply, it wouldn't apply to you. But in any other situation where you have shared water and especially recirculating water, it probably works.
Okay, so let's come back to that as to what the question is, what do we do in a situation where every unit has its own water supply? But in this scenario, John, what would you have anything to add to what Matt was just saying?
No, I think that's one of the biggest problems, especially with the hot water circulating. It causes a lot of pinhole leaks, and in the water we have right now in many different regions, it's real hard and it really beats up the copper piping. So looking for a good water treatment system for the domestic hot water would be the way to go.
Okay. And is there anything that you should be doing if you do have individual water for each unit?
Not much. They do have different systems, but when it comes to the garden style, like homes and stuff like that, there's really not much that you can do.
Okay.
But you don't tend to have the same kind of like aggressive deterioration of the lines either. So usually your pipes are going to last quite a bit longer when you don't have water constantly circulating through them.
Okay.
And then, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just sort of going back to your question, then there's the waste lines. And so the best thing you can do to preserve those is to clean them regularly.
Okay. And what does cleaning look like?
So there's a lot of different methods. Two of the biggest methods are snaking them. They actually get a plumber out there, and because these units don't have cleanouts, it's not a requirement. You actually have to go in through some kitchen sinks and open some P-traps and run a snake, which does work, but it doesn't work completely. So we've been what we've been doing for the last few years is hydrojetting. And basically what a hydrojetter is basically a pressure washer. And you basically stick this into a drain, get into the main line of the vertical stack, and then it kind of flushes it all out. And we try to do this on a yearly basis, especially right now. There's a lot of residents and vendors in these units who kind of use their garbage disposals as trash cans. So they're throwing in, vegetable grounds or coffee grounds, which kind of harm and build up in the pipes.
Yeah.
So we notice if we did this process on a yearly basis, it kind of prevents a lot of backups in a lot of units, and it expands the lifespan of these pipes.
Okay. Now you mentioned that these units don't have cleanouts. Some do, right?
It's really rare, but some do. Yes.
Can you add cleanouts?
You could. It's something that's it's a little difficult, right? Cleanouts have to be near a drain line, and sometimes these drain lines are in the walls, either next to someone's living room or it's next to someone's bathroom. And a lot of residents don't want to see a cleanout cap on the wall. Sometimes you get lucky and you could put them under their sinks, but that's depending on the layout of the plumbing, it varies.
Okay. Anything that you would add on that, Matt?
Well, I was just going to ask John, in like a garden style scenario, if you have a few units and they're sharing one main drain line that goes to the sewer, would you still recommend hydrojetting that main line?
Yes. So there's two ways of doing it. So there's a vertical riser. That's where basically all the waste comes from the units. I would want to get cleaned at least once or twice a year. Now, the main line is where all the debris falls before it goes into the street. The main lines you would want to hydrojet at least once a year. Hydrojetting is the best way to clean out the main lines down in the garage.
Okay. Are there any other clean out approaches or anything else that a manager or a board member should be thinking about? Or is it like just go right to the hydrojet, or any other considerations?
Educating the residents, what to put down the sinks is the best thing, right? A lot of this can be prevented if residents understood what the sink was actually made for, right? It's there to wash a dish, get some of the grounds off, and then let the water flow for a little bit. Some of these residents nowadays are kind of just, like you said, using them as trash cans, and that's what really beats up these pipes. That's what causes a lot of the grease and gunk to get built up in the lines. So for these residents or board members that are looking to maintenance their equipment, I would just, educate. Educate, I think it goes a long way.
All right. So what are the signs, like if you, where we started off this conversation, we were talking about repiping. So what are the signs that, that might be something that you really have to seriously consider. And maybe this really is the only solution. The hydrojetting is not going to solve the problem.
Well, you're going to notice signs is you get a plumber in there and he's snaking a line and the line busts through the cast iron pipe.
Right.
That's a huge sign that the cast iron has lost is strength. It's starting to weaken. You also notice smells in the units. You notice a lot of smells because the pipe is starting to crack. So a lot of the gas smells that are trapped in this cast iron pipe will escape, start going into units, and it'll get into multiple units.
So play this out for me. You've got a plumber in. They're snaking a line. It busts through the pipe. How is a board supposed to make a determination in that situation? Do we just have an isolated situation here where we need to replace that pipe, or how do we know, okay, we need to actually be considering repiping, an entire building?
Well, the best way to do it, the way we've done it in the past, is using a camera. So we've ran cameras down cast iron pipes, and they can determine the condition of the inner walls of the pipe, whether they're weakened, they're cracked, or they're starting to show signs of heavy rusting. That'll give us a good indication on the condition of the piping.
Okay. And I'm assuming that would require a certain cooperation from the residents. You're needing to access the units.
Yes. And the good thing is something like this, you don't have to get into every single unit. You can get to every third unit and basically run a camera, which is a good thing. Cameras can go down a good 24 feet, so you don't have to go into every unit.
All right. So, Matt, you've got a plumber who runs a snake, busts through a pipe. Then we bring out somebody and they start putting cameras into the pipes. And the conclusion is, hey, you've got to repipe this whole building or this whole series of buildings or whatever the situation might be. So the manager or the board member starts making phone calls and saying, hey, I need to get some quotes on how to go about doing this and what's it going to cost. When going to make that kind of a phone call, what are the types of things that a manager or a board member should have in mind and be ready to address in that kind of a situation? You're talking to a vendor and you're going to say, hey, I want you to come out and repipe my building. What else do you say?
Well, I think, as with most projects, the more information you have going into it, the better the quality of the quotes you're going to get will be in the end. So, understanding whether the building is relatively new and probably has somewhat accurate plumbing plans, or if it's a really old property and maybe there have been a lot of modifications made over the years, is good to know, because that will probably change what the bidders will need to know. Do they have to physically inspect a lot of the units, or are there some plans that they could refer to that would give them some decent idea of the quantities that they're going to need? And then beyond that, the board would need to consider setting some policy in the beginning around what happens to the repair of the units, because anytime you do a full-scale repipe, you're going to have to be opening the walls inside people's units, and that, no matter what, gets you into a discussion of who's going to pay to put back what was taken out. And you may have some units with just simple painted drywall, and other units that have really expensive stone cladding on the walls and things like that. And so I would always suggest that at the beginning of the project, that the board be aware that those questions will come up. And so have a conversation with legal counsel and with the bidders about exactly what's involved in the project, so you can set some kind of policy and then set the expectations for the residents about what the association is going to do and what we may need their cooperation to do. We'll give you a new pipe and put the walls back, but you might be on your own to put your stone back.
Right. And that's where they may want to put their own personal insurance on notice or potentially make a claim there.
If they have damage. Yeah,
Right.
Certainly.
Okay. Anything else that you would add on that, John?
No, I think that's perfect. I think the biggest point is just to make sure you have accurate plans. I mean, that's the biggest part here. Fortunately, we can't just open all the walls just to take a look. A lot of these walls are closed up, and some of these are model homes where we're not just going to open up, peekable holes just to see the condition of the pipe. So making sure you have accurate plans is the biggest key.
Yeah.
The other thing that some communities have done, which is not necessarily the best approach, but you could consider is if it's a vertical building like a high rise, requiring that when people remodel their units, they replace the lines within their unit. And the association may pay for the replacement of the lines, but that they need to allow that work.
Right.
So this is obviously a very invasive process if you get to this stage. Talk to me a little bit about other options going down the road of looking at using epoxy solutions or other less invasive solutions. Should boards consider those kinds of options?
Well, for me, the epoxy solution, I know it's a word that it's getting spread a lot. You know, it's been going around for the last 7 years since I've heard about epoxy solutions. But there's a lot that goes with epoxy, you know, and one of the biggest keys for epoxy is that the pipes have to be completely cleaned, free of any kind of grease for the epoxy to grip to adhere to. Now, that's kind of an impossible thing to do to a tall vertical building. You know, even a garden style home, it's hard to guarantee that you can get all the grease out of the pipe for the epoxy to grip. In the past, I've heard that the epoxy does not grip to certain sections of the pipe because it wasn't cleaned properly, and it breaks apart. And when it breaks apart like in clay pieces. So that would eventually start to cause a lot of backups in the building. Not even a snake can go in there and break apart this epoxy when it breaks apart, you know? So then that becomes a problem where you have to open up the wall and then replace the pipe when you should have just done that in the first place.
I think, one of the things that you have to keep in mind too is that you talk about like vertical main drain lines, but it's easy to forget that there's a whole bunch of horizontal pieces
right.
that connect to those verticals. And so it can be hard, not just when you're cleaning, but like when applying epoxy, to get it to adhere evenly to all of the different like angles within the piping system.
Right. Yeah. And then another fear that we had too, which happened in a few other locations is, you know, let's just say the epoxy does grip to the walls of the pipe. What happens eventually is when you have to go in there and do your normal maintenance, snaking or hydrojetting, it actually breaks apart that epoxy within the pipe, which then starts to come apart, starts to fall in the horizontal lines. And then you got to start taking apart the pipe just to get rid of all the debris that fell in there. So epoxy, in my opinion, it's not a fix. You know, I don't even consider it being a Band-Aid. It's something that I don't recommend for the high rises or garden style buildings. It's just not a product that I think has really been used that often. I think if it was, a lot of buildings would be using it, and it's not. That's not the case right now. Most buildings are just replacing the pipe in the long run.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying there's a certain gamble associated with the epoxy, and in your opinion, it's not worth the gamble.
That's correct.
Because of the potential issues that could arise.
That's correct.
If somebody is selling epoxy as a solution, is that generally their main angle, or do you have companies that give you both options of we'll actually repipe or we'll do an epoxy liner? Do you have companies that provide both options? We
do. There are companies that provide both. You know, they throw the epoxy out first because it's like half the price, right? You know, to replumb a building, like Matt was saying, it's not just repiping; it's taking apart walls, putting back new finishes. So it's, you know, it's a heavy cost to an association. Doing epoxy is just, you know, half the price sometimes. Yeah.
I guess what I was getting at is, do these companies have a vested interest in trying to talk you into epoxy? Because it sounds like you're not right. Particularly a fan of that as an option. And so is it possible that boards could hear a sales pitch, hey, epoxy is actually not going to be as bad as John says, but maybe they have a vested interest in that? Or are there companies that you can go to that can give you a pitch either way and kind of help boards understand pros and cons?
There are, you know, they got the fly-by vendors that'll come under your door and, you know, sell you the whole world, right? And then, like you said, their pitch is we can save you half the price of a repiping. So you just got to be careful with companies like that. You know, references are the biggest key. How long have they been around? You know, check that stuff. Check other properties that they've done already. Talk to those managers, talk to those boards to see how well it's been working out.
Oh. Matt, do you have any other perspective on the epoxy angle?
No, I totally echo what John has said. I think that, I wouldn't necessarily say it's never ever going to work for you, but definitely do homework because I don't think that it's very common, and I think that's for a reason.
All right. So the last thing I was going to ask, and this is directed to you, Matt. So you're in a board meeting, and the board has selected a plumber who's going to go in and repipe an entire community, a building, whatever it might be, and they walk the board through. Okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's what's going to happen. This is our timeline. This is the cost. And then they leave, and the board now looks at you, Matt, and says, "Okay, we need to start thinking through some of the logistics of this with our residents, with our homeowners." What are some of the things that you would maybe point out to a board that they need to be thinking about from a logistics standpoint that the plumbing company is not necessarily going to handle on this, but that the board needs to proactively address?
Well, beyond what we talked about earlier about, how you're going to handle the repair to the interior of the units once the project is done, I would just think about what's the path of travel for the plumbers and the workers, what kind of protection is going to be installed within the units, who's going to be available to allow access, what kind of notice can we provide to the residents so that if they have other homes, they can make their plans to go there. We can give people realistic expectations of how long they potentially won't be able to live in their units. And whether or not, maybe there are decent hotels nearby, and maybe we can reach out and arrange more favorable rates for people who will be displaced. But definitely the timing and the communication with the residents is really critical, and narrowing down, an accurate schedule for how they're going to move through the project so that you can give people a realistic forecast of when they won't be able to use their apartment, because you have to keep in mind that in a garden style community, it may be a bunch of neighboring units next to each other who will be impacted at the same time. In a high rise, it may be lots of units above and below that won't be able to use their plumbing for a given period of time.
Yeah.
Right.
So it sounds like setting expectations with residents is a huge component to this. I would assume you're going to be communicating by email and actual mailers. You're going to probably want to hold town hall meetings and answer questions and bring the vendor in to help to address those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Over communicating is really important.
Yes.
The homeowners, if you're doing a repipe, they're going to be displaced. Am I right? You're looking at probably, I don't want to attach a specific time frame, but just generally speaking, about 10 days or so. Is that probably about the time frame you're looking at?
It's about good 6 to 7 days per unit.
Okay.
To get it all repiped.
So you're going to tell homeowners it's going to be a week, maybe a little bit more.
Basically.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. And then is there any leverage that the association has with residents who maybe say, you know what, I don't want to cooperate with this, and I'm not going to provide access to my unit. And what you're usually going to have a handful of those in any situation. I'm assuming that the board has some leverage as to how to address those issues.
Yeah, I mean, I would say you definitely want to have this conversation with legal counsel before you even start the project, not later, because there potentially will be people who will say they don't want to cooperate. But I think that in order to consider a project that's this complicated and invasive, you probably have real problems. And so the association should have a fair amount of leverage to tell somebody, look, we understand this is really inconvenient for you, and we're sorry. It's inconvenient for all of us. And you do not get to force a lot of other people to not be able to live in their units because they're constantly having leaks or something like that because the piping has failed.
Yeah.
All right.
So we're going to have to work through that.
Yeah. So the thrust we would recommend, though, is over communicate up front and do everything you can to get buy-in, but just know that there may be other steps that you need to prepare ahead of time for in case you're having a challenge getting access to a particular unit.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, is there anything I haven't asked about that I should be in order to be thinking about this subject?
No, I think all the questions are pretty much there. Like I said, the main thing is investigation. For the repiping, make sure you investigate what you have. Because there's a lot of plumbers out there that might come to you or vendors and tell you, hey, your pipes are full of sludge and grease. You got to replace them right away, and that's really not true. There's ways to correct that. There's ways to flush out that grease before you have to actually repipe a building. Yeah. Like I said, I gave a couple examples. Splintering. Cracked tiles, cracked or rusted piping like that. That's all indications of when you have to repipe a building. An age of a building, if it's already hitting that 50-year-old mark, might be about that time to do it as well. You had mentioned about some of these residents that, may push back to do some of the plumbing repairs. Some of these vendors are happy to do it. Some of these residents are happy to do it. They're excited to do it. I mean, it's really not much pushback, because it's something that's been happening for a lot of years, and they're just tired of the water leaks. They're tired of the pipes their walls being opened. So it's something that they welcome. Not a lot of pushback.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, thank you both very much. And I hope you found this to be helpful. And this concludes this episode of The Uncommon Area. And we would encourage you to check out other episodes where we address other questions and issues that are helpful to understand in operating a homeowners association.